So then there's that. This layer's the layer of the Mafia and the CIA, and was there another layer above them, like the big banks? They were getting the money, the benefits of the money laundering from drugs, because they would be laundered through the U.S. big banking system.
Well, that's correct.
Were they also benefiting from this at even a
yes.
same level or higher level?
Well, the banks and insurance companies, believe it or not, were some of the big institutions that got bailed out by the S&Ls. If you had a piece of property or an office building, the first mortgage or the first lien on it might be held by a big bank or a big insurance company. And when the savings and loan would come in and take out everything and refinance the whole deal, the banks and S&Ls would get paid off by the savings and loan. In fact, that happened in the Khashoggi deal. Texas Commerce Bank had a $15 million mortgage against Khashoggi's property. And the money to pay off that mortgage came from Mainland Savings, and also Lamar Savings in Austin joined in that. So Texas Commerce Bank got all their money back from the savings and loans. And you find it happening time and time again. A piece of property will have a big first mortgage by a bank or insurance company that will get paid off by the S&L when they take the whole deal out.
Well, as I understand the big banks, I mean the Wall Street banks and all, a lot of these deals, a lot of the property would be resold, and eventually they would come up into the hands of these bigger banks and insurance companies like in New York. And so I guess they would be the first ones to be paid off in any type of bailout, would they not?
Well, sure. I mean, if they're holding the first mortgage, they're going to get the money first before anybody. And the savings loan might be holding a third or fourth mortgage. I mean, they would wrap these things and flip these things so that the S&L might be third or fourth in line and would never get, once the property's sold and the first mortgagee is paid off, the S&L's left with nothing.
Pete, there's a chapter of your book called The Mobsters, Spooks, and George Bush, the Palmer National Bank story, that ties all these things that we're talking about together. In other words, the way that high-level officials with connections to the government, corporate and political officials, formed a bank, the Palmer National Bank, and how it became connected with all these unsavory operations. Do you want to give us some detail on this to sort of concretely illustrate this analysis?
Yeah, Palmer National Bank had just about everybody in it. It was a small bank, still exists in Washington, D.C., about 2 blocks north of the White House. It was started by a Louisiana businessman named Harvey McLean and a political operative from Washington, D.C. called Stephen Halper. And McLean and Halper met in 1980 when they were both working on George Bush's presidential campaign. And Halper later was head of the policy group for Bush. And then when Reagan became the nominee and Bush was named vice presidential candidate, Halper went to work for their campaign as part of the policy group and was actually a high-level official in what they called the October Surprise Group, the group that was trying to determine whether or not Carter was going to pull off an October surprise and get the Iranian hostages home or whatever. And Halper was in charge of this group. His father-in-law was Ray Klein, who was the former deputy director of intelligence of the CIA. Klein was working with them, with Bush. And then when Reagan and Bush won, Halper went to work for the State Department. They created a position for him. And James Baker, by the way, was the one that brought Halper over to the Reagan-Bush team after Reagan became the nominee from the Bush team. So, and Harvey McLean was a businessman from Shreveport, Louisiana, and he was being financed by none other than Herman K. Beebe, the Mafia associate. McLean moves to Dallas and buys Paris Savings and Loan in Paris, Texas, and is borrowing money from Vernon Savings, from Continental Savings in Houston, and later, of course, all these loans go bad and Paris goes bust, and McLean's business deals cost taxpayers probably over $100 million. That's kind of getting ahead of the story. Back in '83, McLean and Halper are taking a trip to China, and they start talking about, let's get a bank in Washington, D.C., and so they start Palmer National Bank. Palmer was named after McLean's grandmother and daughter. And the capital, the $3 million capital to start the bank, came from Herman K. Beebe and Bossier Bank and Trust,
The
BB's
guy
Bank.
connected to the mob in Louisiana.
Right.
He seems to be everywhere.
He's everywhere.
And to Misher, and to Ben Barnes, John Connolly, all these people. So as soon as they start this bank, they begin lending money to conservative Republican PACs like Bob Dole and Jack Kemp. And then they take on another client, the National Endowment for the Preservation of Liberty, which was started by Oliver North and a guy named Spitz Channel to funnel private donations to the Contras. Okay, and of course the biggest donor was Ellen Garwood here in Austin, the widow of the former Supreme Court Justice. And Palmer National Bank was also lending money to the National Endowment for operating loans and for furniture loans, and helping funnel the money. That's where they had the money would go from Palmer National Bank to another Washington bank, to the Cayman Islands, and then over to Geneva, Switzerland, in the bank account at Credit Suisse, where not only was Contra money being flowed into, but Iranian arms profits were also being...
Secord was operating
Yes,
out of that.
that was Secord's. And then it would go out to the Contras. And Palmer was the starting point of the money. And Palmer National Bank also made a loan on a beach house in Solano Beach, California, that BB and Dixon would use to entertain S&L regulators, including L.L. Bowman. In fact, that's where he allegedly had a tryst with a prostitute in that beach house. And Palmer National Bank had a piece of the action on that beach house. And later, Stephen Halper was, when he got caught in the DebateGate scandal, if you recall that, the theft of the Carter debating manuals that ended up in the Reagan-Bush campaign that apparently James Baker or William Casey, or both of them, were involved in.
And that was just part of an enormous covert action against the Carter administration, which they had something like 137 operatives at all kinds of high levels, spying, snooping, and even stealing top secret documents. And this is just one of their operations.
Yeah, that's correct. Well, Halper was involved in that. And he, of course, his name surfaced in 1984 when this came out, and he had to sort of leave. He kind of backed out of Palmer National Bank. But he stayed in touch with these people, of course. And then when Oliver North was fired by Reagan in November 1986, when the scheme where they were, using profits from the Iranian arms deals to fund the Contras, and all came tumbling out, and Reagan fired North, the very last entry in Oliver North's White House diaries was legal defense firm - Stephen Halper, our old Palmer National Bank guy.
Who also, again, I want to make this October surprise connection, because Halper was the head of the October Surprise Committee for the Reagan election team in 1980, which was frightened to death that the Carter administration was going to negotiate the release of the hostages, which may be one of the reasons why they stole the debate book, as well as did these other covert actions against Carter, because they wanted to find out what he was doing for this hostage release, and if possible subvert it and give the Iranians a better deal. At least that's the account that Gary Sick and others give.
That's correct.
And
that was in the middle of it.
And how it worked out that way. They rigged a deal so that the Iranians would hold the hostages until after the election and in return for arms. And lo and behold, 20 minutes after Reagan raised his hand and said that he would ruin the country, the hostages were released.
Well, and here we had this little bank, that was involved in all this, being financed with Louisiana Mafia money. And when Herman K. Beebe was first convicted in 1985, of course, they moved that loan out of Bossier Bank to a little savings and loan in Beaumont, Texas, called San Jacinto Savings, different from San Jacinto in Houston. And if you look at the board members of that bank, you find two people who were major stockholders in the casinos, Caesars Casino in Las Vegas, that of course was being skimmed by the Chicago Mafia at that time.
So it's absolutely incredible how all this is connected. October Surprise, Iran-Contra, SNL, Mafia, CIA, all of this, William Casey, all of these operations under the Reagan administration were interconnected, as well as the players.
that you find the same people and the same threads running through these operations, and the money, from SNL is going into these operations.
Wow.
Can you tell us another story about a landing strip in Lajitas, Texas?
Yes. I first found out about the possible connections to the savings and loans and the CIA in, I guess, the fall of 1988, when a woman in Houston called up my associate at the Houston Post, Greg C., and berated him about some of our coverage of SNLs that weren't getting the whole story. So we went to see her. Her name was Rebecca Sims. She had been Robert Corson, Mishra's former son-in-law, his accountant. And she had quit because she'd been asked to commit bankruptcy and tax fraud. And so she started investigating Corson. And she found out that Corson had been an asset of the CIA. And when she first told me that, I really wasn't interested in it at all. I had no interest in it. I wasn't looking for the CIA. I was looking for the Mafia. And I guess I was even a little disappointed. But when I went back to my office, I remembered several things. One, when we had done the story on Walter Mishra and had been calling everybody, all his people he knew, just to get background information on him, one of his close associates told me about the 700,000 acres in Belize in Central America that he had bought into, and that his associate thought that this was a CIA operation. And this was someone who's very close to Mishra and would not say something like that unless he knew it had something to, and I sort of filed that, away in my mind. I remembered that came up, and then I remember there was a organized crime strike force prosecutor in Kansas City that was chasing Mario Renda, the New York mob money broker. And I was chasing Renda too, so we had a lot of contact. And I'd been sending him our stories we'd been writing in the Houston Post. And he said almost the same thing Rebecca Sims had said: you're missing something big here, there's something you're not getting. And so I wondered if he was talking about the CIA. So I flew up to Kansas City and met with him, and sure enough, that was it. He was talking about the CIA. So that's how the CIA connection arose. And Rebecca Sims had been told about the CIA connection from a man named Richard Brennicky.
Oh my gosh. His name pops up in
October
all kinds
Surprise,
of October Surprise,
Contra Drugs.
Drugs.
Brennicky had been the sort of renegade intelligence agent in Portland, Oregon. He had received a lot of notoriety because some of the breaking stories on Iran-Contra had come from him on the Iranian arms deals and some of the Contra arms deals. And the New York Times and Newsweek had used him as a major source. And so I went up to see Brennicky, and I spent a week with him. And when I got back, I really didn't have much because Brennicky didn't have a lot of documents backing up what he was saying. It was a very frustrating experience with Brennicky. I mean, he's a typical kind of intelligence agent that will deliberately lie to you on some occasions. I mean, you just can't trust everything he tells you, but on the other hand, he will tell you the truth on a number of occasions. And he, at one point in our conversations, began describing a landing strip in far west Texas that had been a CIA guns for drugs deal, guns and drugs transshipment point. And he said they flew C-130s in and out of there. It was a 4,000 foot. So I ripped a big sheet of paper out of my legal notebook and I said, draw me a map. So he starts drawing this map, and here was Lajitas, which is west of Big Bend. He said about 10 miles northeast, and there's this mesa. And he had a very detailed map. 4,000 feet. He gave me the way it was oriented, the fact that there was a mountain just north of it, and there was a mesa there. And so I took that back to Houston with me, hoping, maybe this would check out. So I got a USGS Class A topo map of the area, which I was absolutely positive would show a landing strip that big, 4,000 feet. And I get the map out and I look at it, and I can see about where it should have been according to his map, and there was nothing on the map. And so I said, well, I'll give it one more shot. I'll get the aerial photographs that they use to make these maps. They take aerial photographs. And so I ordered the aerial photographs, and I got them out, and I looked at them, and there it was, right exactly where the landing strip. exactly where he described it. And the FAA had no record of this. It wasn't on any map. And so I went out to that, it's about 15 miles northeast of Lajitas, and about, I'd say less than 10 miles from Terlingua, and actually drove out to it and looked at it and began talking to people about it, and basically got it confirmed that it was a C-130s flew in there with arms and drugs. And Brennicky had told me that when he flew in there, that he asked the people he was flying in there with, who were people, by the way, associated with the Medellin cartel, whose landing strip this was. He was told it was they told him Walter Mischer. Now Mischer owns, at that time it owned probably close to 300,000, maybe more acres in that area, but he didn't own that piece of property. He had land to the west of it and land to the south of it. So when I began researching who owned this property, I found a widow in Florida actually owned that property, and she had never been there in her life, and only found out a few years before I talked to her that a landing strip was there because one of her relatives went hunting and told her, "Did you know there's a landing strip right in the middle of your property?" And she said, "No." And she said it was done without her knowledge or permission. And of course, it was actually the only place in that area. That's a very rough, rugged country there, just west of Big Bend. It was the only level place for miles and miles around in that vicinity that you could put a landing strip. And of course, if a widow from Florida who's never been there owns it, and just about anybody who wanted to probably could go. And of course, the law enforcement had to know about it. When you talk to them, you get contradictory answers and inconsistent answers, and they're trying to cover up, obviously, although they would acknowledge that they'd seen C-130s in the vicinity. There's no reason for C-1. Of course, there is a low-level training route for C-130s out of San Antonio in that area. What a perfect cover, of course, for flying in C-130s.
Can we get up to a higher level of politics again? Mr. Clean, Mr. Bentsen, Lloyd Bentsen, he's connected with this in some way.
Yeah, I ran into Bentsen in a number of places. The first place I ran into Lloyd Bentsen was in Jefferson Savings, which was in the Rio Grande Valley, I believe in McAllen. Jefferson Savings had been started by Lloyd Bentsen and his brother and Bentsen's father back in the mid-50s. And they controlled it up until the mid-70s when they sold it to a man named Guillermo Hernandez Cartaya. Cartaya is one of the really bad boys of the Western Hemisphere. He's a Cuban exile, fought in the Bay of Pigs, was a member of the infamous 2506 Brigade, had been involved in narcotics trafficking, money laundering, gun running, terrorist activities out of Florida with a company called World Finance. The IRS and the FBI had close to 200 people investigating World Finance in the mid-70s, and was ready to pop Cartaya big when the CIA stopped them and came in and basically had the investigation dismantled. And as a result, Cartaya was just convicted on income tax charges. At that very same time, he comes and buys Jefferson Savings from the Bentsen family, okay, and proceeds to loot it and run drug money through it. When the Justice Department came in to investigate Cartaya, were brought in by the Texas regulators, and Art Leiser, who was the chief S&L examiner for the state of Texas, brought in the feds. The CIA came down and met with the prosecutor and asked him to back off Cartaya because of all the favors Cartaya had done for our government, including, it turns out, scamming about $30 million from a United Arab Emirates bank with the apparent permission of the CIA. And Cartaya, the Justice Department did not back off Cartaya on that deal. He was convicted, but his sentence was rolled into his IRS sentence. And I don't know how many years, he probably only did a couple of years in jail. The next year after that happened, Cartaya was again indicted along with his partner, Camilo Padreda, another Cuban exile in Miami. That indictment was stopped for some reason. The Justice Department said later it was flawed. but if it's flawed, why do they draw it up? Camilo Pedrera shows up 10 years later as a partner of Jeb Bush, the president's son, in Miami. Now, when I found out about Cartaya and also Jefferson Savings, in fact, Lloyd Bentsen had, owned part of that, I called up Benson's office to ask him about it. I got his press secretary, Jack DeVore. I asked him my questions, what was Benson's role in this S&L, what did he own, did he know Cartaya, et cetera, et cetera. And DeVore said he'd get back to me, that the senator was in some conference on the Canary Islands, which is off the coast of Africa. About an hour later, DeVore calls me back and said the senator never owned any stock in this S&L, doesn't know anything about it, never had anything to do with it. And I said, are you sure about this? He said, yes, I satisfied myself. He doesn't recall owning anything. And I said, well, that's funny. I got a document here from the S&L department that shows he owned 16.7% of the original stock and continued to own it up into the 60s, and these signatures are notarized. He said, well, I'll get back to you. 30 minutes later, I get a call from Lloyd Bentsen himself from the Canary Islands saying, oh, yes, he had owned stock in that, but he got out of it in the mid-60s and bought in Brazosport Savings, which later became Continental Savings. Okay? And then I asked him about Cartaya. He said he knew it. I said, what about the CIA interference? He assured me that hadn't happened because he would have known about it. Well, in fact, I got this story straight from the prosecutor that the CIA went to. And so either Bentsen lied to DeVore or DeVore lied to me. There's no other explanation for it. I mean, somebody lied. I mean, they told me a lie, that Bentsen had never been owned any stock in this S&L. And if I hadn't had that document, they would have gotten away with the lie. Now, it's interesting to note that this S&L that Bentsen bought after he got out of Jefferson became Continental Savings, and that purchase was financed by Herman K. Beebe. So it's possible that Mafia money went to Lloyd Bentsen. Now, when I asked DeVore about that, he said they didn't know that Beebe was financing Kelly, so had no knowledge, Carol Kelly, the guy that owned it, whether this was mob money or not. And in fact, it was.
Well, didn't Bentsen also later, when he was running as vice president, didn't he put the kibosh on any investigation or statements in any of the debates about the S&Ls? Isn't that part of your book too?
Yes. Well, in 1988, the country knew we had an S&L problem. We didn't know the extent of it. Okay. The original estimates had been something like maybe $10 to $15 million. The Republicans, of course, with Bush as the candidate, did not bring up the Bush's son Neil was right in the middle of Silverado Savings, which was about to be taken down. In fact, was taken down only a couple of weeks after the presidential election. Someone in Washington had called the regulators in Topeka, Kansas, that regulated Silverado, and told them not to shut Silverado down until after the presidential election, and that's in fact what happened. On the other side, Bentsen was the Democratic vice presidential nominee. He went to the Dukakis campaign people and told them not to bring up the S&L crisis. And so they didn't. The Democrats did not use that as an issue, and they could have pounded the Republicans over the head with it.
And maybe won the election in 1988.
Perhaps. And of course, we had the Keating Five. Four of the Keating Five were Democrats. I mean, the Democratic Congress had just as much to answer for as the Republican administration. And so neither side wanted to bring it up. Of course, both sides were being paid off by people like Mischer. I mean, they always cover their bets. The people like Mischer, they support both sides. So regardless of who wins, they've got an in. And George Bush and Lloyd Bentsen are part and parcel of this same small Houston businessman circle that Walter Mischer's at the middle of, Joe Russo is part of, and a guy named Jim Bath, a CIA operative in Houston, is good friends with George Bush and George Bush's son, George W. Bush, and has done investments for Lloyd Bentsen and was in business with Lloyd Bentsen's son. And Bath, of course, ties in with Mischer. He got loans from Mischer's bank. And it's all a very tight little circle here. That Bush and Bentsen are two peas in a pod as far as being controlled and dealing with and have friendship with the same people.
And what about any other connections that Bentsen might have to the S&L crisis other than him owning this one S&L for 20 years? Did he have investments in or connections with other S&Ls that were involved in the crisis, or did he do things as a senator that might be involved in making sure there's no investigations, et cetera?
Well, I don't know if he ever directly intervened, but he certainly didn't push for it. And he was head of the Senate Finance Committee that could have done all sorts of investigations. He never did. I mean, in fact, he did his best to see that the S&L crisis was not brought up. He had 3 savings and loans at one time that all ended up in the hands of either the Mafia or the CIA people. Jefferson Savings went to Cartaya. Continental Savings went to Carroll Kelly. It was financed completely by Herman K. Beebe. And Ben Franklin Savings later ended up in the hands of Walter Mischer.
Now, this in and of itself is absolutely incredible, that S&Ls or banks or any institution can be sold to Mafia-controlled groups. How is this even possible?
Well, it's possible because the people in power either don't know or don't want to know that these are Mafia people. I mean, the Justice Department had not done the kind of investigation required. The Federal Home Loan Bank Board wasn't doing investigations, and the press was not reporting. Of course, everybody knew who Beebe was. From the Dallas Morning News wrote about Beebe and the Texas Rent-A-Bank scandal, but seemed to forget about it, 10 years later when they're back involved in S&Ls. And no one, raised, I mean, when you've got Congress not doing anything, we've got the Justice Department not doing anything, we got the press not doing anything, that the public is not going to find out, and nobody's going to know.
And what does Bentsen say, that he didn't know that these were Mafia connections, that he just sold his interests and someone bought them and he didn't investigate?
Well, I think he knew who he was selling to, but he could say we didn't know the money was coming from the Mafia. Well, that's the kind of ignorance we don't need if indeed he didn't know. I mean, it's an ignorance that's almost criminal. I mean, if he didn't do anything criminal by actually knowing and intending that it happened, his ignorance borders on recklessness.
Pete, we have a lot more questions for you, and we're out of time for this program, but would you like to continue on and do a second program? We want to get into how you got this story and the incredible information that you got and then wove together, and the problems you had in getting stories printed and also getting the book published. Would you stay here and do us
Sure.
the favor of that?
Sure.
Great, thank you. That's the end of this Alternative Views. We frequently hear from viewers who request a list of news publications, which we use on Alternative Views, and also a reading list for U.S. power structure in the mass media. If you would like to have these, send a stamped, self-addressed envelope to the Alternative Information Network, P.O.